My name is Elena, and I want to tell you about the day my daughter slapped me at her own wedding. But more importantly, I want to tell you about what I had already done weeks before that slap ever happened, and why I was able to smile when her hand struck my face in front of 200 guests. To understand that moment, you need to understand Rebecca. My daughter has always been beautiful, charming, and absolutely ruthless when it comes to getting what she wants. For 26 years, I told myself that her cruelty was just immaturity, that her selfishness was a phase she would outgrow, that the heart I knew was buried somewhere beneath her calculating exterior would eventually surface. I was wrong about all of it. Rebecca learned early that tears and tantrums could manipulate me into giving her whatever she demanded. When she was 7, she threw herself on the floor of a toy store and screamed until I bought her a $200 dollhouse I couldn't afford. When she was 16, she told me she hated me and wished I was dead because I wouldn't let her go on an unsupervised spring break trip to Cancun. When she was 21, she moved in with a boyfriend I'd never met and called me only when she needed money. But it was after my divorce 3 years ago that I really saw who Rebecca had become. My ex-husband Paul and I had been married for 28 years when we finally admitted our relationship was over. The divorce was amicable enough, we'd simply grown apart and wanted different things from our remaining years. Paul moved to Arizona to be closer to his aging mother, and I stayed in the house we'd bought when Rebecca was small. The house had always been Rebecca's safety net. Whenever her relationships fell apart or her job situations became untenable or her financial decisions caught up with her, she knew she could come home. I'd always welcomed her with open arms, grateful for any opportunity to rebuild our relationship. But after the divorce, something shifted in how Rebecca saw me. I was no longer part of a parental unit she had to navigate carefully. I was just mom, alone and apparently desperate for her approval. She began treating me less like a mother and more like a resource she could exploit without consequence. The first sign should have been how she reacted when I told her about the divorce settlement. Paul and I had built a comfortable life together. The house was paid off, worth about $400,000 in today's market. I'd worked part-time for most of Rebecca's childhood, but I'd also been smart about investments and savings. With my share of our retirement accounts and the house, I was looking at a secure future, not wealthy but certainly stable. When I explained the financial details to Rebecca, her first question wasn't whether I was okay or how I was handling the emotional aspects of the divorce. Her first question was whether I'd considered downsizing to something smaller so I could free up some capital for other opportunities. Other opportunities? I should have asked what she meant by that. Within 6 months of the divorce being finalized, Rebecca had moved back in with me. She'd broken up with her boyfriend in Chicago and needed time to figure things out. She was 23 then, college-educated and perfectly capable of supporting herself, but she presented her return home as temporary and necessary. That temporary arrangement lasted 2.5 years. During that time, Rebecca contributed nothing to household expenses. She had a series of part-time jobs and side hustles, but somehow there was never money left over for rent or groceries or utilities after she'd covered her own personal expenses. Her car payments, her student loans, her credit card bills, her gym membership, her subscription services, these were all non-negotiable necessities. But contributing to the home she lived in, that was apparently optional. Meanwhile, she treated me like a combination housemaid and personal assistant. She expected meals to be prepared, laundry to be done, and social events to be planned around her schedule. If I made dinner and she decided she didn't want what I'd cooked, she'd order takeout and leave me to eat alone. If I asked her to help with household chores, she'd promise to do them later and then disappear for hours. But the worst part was how she spoke to me during those years. Every conversation was an opportunity for her to point out my shortcomings, my poor decisions, my failure to understand what she was going through. According to Rebecca, I was too emotional, too clingy, too invested in her life. I was holding her back from reaching her potential by creating a comfortable environment she didn't have to contribute to. The irony was breathtaking. She was living rent-free in my house, eating food I bought and prepared, using utilities I paid for, and somehow I was the one preventing her from becoming independent. But I tolerated it all because I loved her and because I kept hoping that someday she would remember that she loved me too. The engagement changed everything. Rebecca had been dating Marcus for about 8 months when she announced they were getting engaged. I'd met Marcus only twice during their relationship. Rebecca rarely brought him to the house and never included me in their social activities. He seemed nice enough from what little I'd seen, a software developer with a steady job and a quiet demeanor that complemented Rebecca's more explosive personality. The engagement itself wasn't a surprise. Rebecca had been dropping hints for months about marriage and timelines and what kind of wedding she envisioned. What surprised me was how quickly it became clear that I was expected to finance this vision. "Mom," Rebecca said the day after Marcus proposed, "we need to talk about the wedding budget." We were sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd fed her breakfast every school morning for 12 years, where I'd helped her with homework and listened to her teenage problems and celebrated her achievements. She had her laptop open and was scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed spreadsheet. "I've been doing some research," she continued, "and for the kind of wedding Marcus and I want, we're looking at about $75,000. $75,000. I felt something shift in my chest, a familiar tightness that I'd learned to associate with Rebecca's more outrageous demands. "Honey," I said carefully, "that's a lot of money. Have you and Marcus talked about what you can contribute to the wedding yourselves?" She looked at me like I'd suggested they pay for it with monopoly money. "Mom, Marcus and I are just starting our lives together. We've got student loans and we're saving for a house and he's trying to get his business off the ground. We can't possibly afford a real wedding on our own." A real wedding? As if anything less than $75,000 would be somehow fake or inadequate. "What about a smaller ceremony?" I suggested. "Something intimate with just family and close friends. You could have a beautiful wedding for a fraction of that cost." The look she gave me was pure contempt. "I'm not having some pathetic backyard barbecue just because you don't want to invest in your only daughter's happiness," she snapped. "Every other mother I know is excited to help make their daughter's wedding dreams come true. But you're sitting here trying to talk me out of having the day I've been planning since I was little." Since she was little. I remembered Rebecca as a child, playing dress-up and staging elaborate pretend weddings with her dolls. But I also remembered her changing her mind about those fantasy weddings every few weeks, sometimes wanting a princess theme, sometimes preferring a beach ceremony, sometimes insisting on a space-age celebration in our backyard. The $75,000 extravaganza she was describing now had nothing to do with childhood dreams and everything to do with adult entitlement. But I said yes anyway. Because she was my daughter, and because I wanted her to be happy, and because part of me still believed that if I could give her the wedding she wanted, she might finally see me as the loving mother I'd always tried to be. That decision was the biggest mistake of my life. Over the next 10 months, planning Rebecca's wedding became a full-time job that I wasn't being paid for. She wanted complete control over every decision, but she also expected me to handle all the logistics, negotiations, and payments. I spent hours on the phone with vendors, venues, and service providers, always with Rebecca's detailed specifications and frequent changes in mind. The venue she'd chosen was an upscale country club that charged $25,000 just for the reception hall rental. The catering package was another $18,000 for 200 guests. The photographer she insisted on was a fashionable artist who charged $8,000 for wedding day coverage. The flowers, the music, the decorations, the transportation, every element had to meet Rebecca's exacting standards, and every element came with a premium price tag. But the real cost wasn't just financial. With every vendor meeting, every tasting appointment, every decision-making session, Rebecca treated me less like her mother and more like an incompetent employee she was stuck managing. "Mom, you're not listening," she'd say when I'd suggest alternatives to her most expensive choices. "I've already explained why the cheaper options won't work. Do you want my wedding to look amateur?" "Mom, that's not what I said," she'd snap when I'd try to repeat back her instructions to make sure I understood them correctly. "Pay attention, I don't have time to explain everything twice." "Mom, why is this so difficult for you?" she'd demand when I'd express concerns about timelines or budgets. Other mothers managed to help plan weddings without making everything so complicated. Every conversation left me feeling smaller and more inadequate. But I kept going because the wedding had become a symbol in my mind of everything I'd failed to give Rebecca throughout her childhood, and I was determined to get this one thing right. The breaking point came 6 weeks before the wedding, during what should have been a moment of bonding between mother and daughter. We were at the final dress fitting, something I'd been looking forward to for months. Rebecca looked absolutely stunning in her gown, a custom creation that had cost more than many people's cars. I was standing behind her in the bridal shop, watching her examine herself in the three-way mirror, and for a moment I felt overwhelmed with love and pride. "You look absolutely beautiful, sweetheart," I said softly. "Your father is going to cry when he sees you walking down the aisle." Rebecca's reflection froze in the mirror. When she turned to look at me directly, her expression was ice cold. "Don't you dare make this about Dad," she said quietly, but with an edge that made me step backward. "This day has nothing to do with him or his feelings or his opinions about anything." Paul had offered to contribute to the wedding expenses, but Rebecca had refused his help. She'd told me it was because she didn't want to feel obligated to include him in the planning process, but I was beginning to suspect it had more to do with maintaining complete control over the financial narrative. As long as only I was paying for everything, only I could be blamed if anything went wrong. "I just meant that he'll be proud to see you looking so beautiful," I said, trying to smooth over whatever I'd done wrong. "He'll be proud," Rebecca's voice rose enough that the seamstress looked up from her pins with concern. He walked out on this family, Mom. He decided his new life in Arizona was more important than being here for the most important day of my life. And you want me to care about his feelings? This wasn't true, and Rebecca knew it. Paul had left our marriage, not our family, and certainly not Rebecca. He'd called her regularly, visited during holidays, and offered repeatedly to help with wedding expenses. But Rebecca had rewritten the narrative in her mind to cast herself as the abandoned daughter rather than the adult child whose parents had simply decided to end an unhappy marriage. "Rebecca," I said carefully, "your father loves you very much. The divorce was between him and me, not between him and you." "Don't tell me how to feel about my own father," she snapped. "And don't stand there acting like you're some kind of victim in all this. You got everything in the divorce, Mom. The house, the money, the retirement accounts. You came out just fine." "I got everything." As if the house I'd lived in for 20 years and the retirement savings we'd built together over decades of marriage were prizes I'd won rather than the practical division of a shared life. But it was what she said next that changed everything. "The least you can do is pay for my wedding without making me feel guilty about it. It's not like you have anything else to spend your money on. You don't have a social life, you don't travel, you don't do anything with your time except sit around feeling sorry for yourself. At least helping with my wedding gives your life some purpose. At least helping with my wedding gives your life some purpose." I stood in that bridal shop, surrounded by white tulle and fairy tale fantasies, and finally saw Rebecca clearly for the first time in 26 years. Not the daughter I'd hoped she would become, not the loving child I remembered from earlier years, but the person she actually was. Someone who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, a placeholder to fill the gaps in her life until something better came along. Someone who thought my entire existence was justified only by what I could provide for her. I finished the dress fitting in silence, paid the seamstress for her alterations, and drove home with Rebecca chattering excitedly about last-minute details. She didn't seem to notice that I'd stopped responding to her questions or that my hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. That night I called my lawyer. Janet Stevens had handled my divorce from Paul, and I'd been impressed by her thoroughness and clear-headed approach to difficult situations. When I explained what I wanted to do, she didn't ask a lot of questions about motivation. She simply outlined my options and the timeline required to implement them. "Eleanor," she said, "you need to understand that once we start this process, there's no going back. These kinds of changes have permanent consequences." "I understand," I told her. "That's exactly what I want." Over the next 6 weeks, while Rebecca obsessed over seating charts and centerpieces and last-minute vendor confirmations, I systematically dismantled every assumption she'd made about our relationship and her financial security. The first step was the simplest. I contacted every vendor involved in the wedding and changed the payment structure. Instead of the various installment plans I'd negotiated, I paid everything off in full immediately. The venue, the catering, the photographer, the florist, the band, every outstanding balance was cleared within a week. Rebecca never noticed because she'd never been involved in the actual financial management. She knew I was handling payments, but she'd never bothered to understand the details of contracts, timelines, or outstanding balances. The second step was more complex. Rebecca had been listed as the primary contact on several vendor contracts, with me as the financial guarantor. I had Janet review every agreement and arrange for any post-wedding responsibilities or potential liabilities to be transferred entirely to my name. If anything went wrong after the ceremony, if any disputes arose with vendors, if any additional payments were required, Rebecca would be completely insulated from any consequences. I was essentially buying her a clean exit from any responsibility for the event I was funding. The third step was the most emotionally difficult but also the most necessary. Rebecca had always assumed she was the primary beneficiary of my will. We'd never discussed it directly, but she'd made comments over the years that made it clear she saw my assets as her future inheritance. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies in her mind, these were resources she would eventually control. I changed all of it. My new will established an educational trust fund that would provide college scholarships for students from low-income families. The house would be sold after my death, with the proceeds funding the endowment. My investment accounts would be donated to organizations that supported single mothers re-entering the workforce. My life insurance policies would benefit women's shelters in our community. Rebecca would receive a single payment of $5,000, enough to prove that she hadn't been accidentally omitted, but small enough to make my intentions unmistakably clear. But the fourth step was the one that would have the most immediate impact on her post-wedding life. For the past 2 years, Rebecca had been living in my house without contributing to any expenses. But she'd also accumulated significant debt in her own name: credit cards, student loans, a car payment she'd taken on when her old vehicle finally died. She'd managed these obligations by keeping her living expenses at zero, and putting every dollar of her irregular income toward minimum payments and personal spending. What she didn't know was that I'd been listed as the emergency contact and financial reference on several of her accounts. When she'd applied for her car loan, the bank had called to verify my income and confirm that she had stable housing arrangements. When she'd requested credit limit increases, the credit card companies had checked with me to confirm her residential stability. I'd always verified these references because I thought I was helping her build credit and financial independence. But I'd also created a situation where her debt was tied to her living arrangement with me. I contacted every creditor that had me listed as a reference or guarantor and formally withdrew my support. I submitted written notice that Rebecca would no longer be residing at my address after a specified date, and that I would no longer be providing financial assistance or housing support that enabled her debt payments. The impact wouldn't be immediate. Most of these changes wouldn't affect her credit or payment requirements for several months. But by early fall, when the honeymoon phase of her marriage was over, Rebecca would discover that her financial house of cards was collapsing. The final step was the most symbolic but also the most satisfying. I'd been paying for Rebecca's cell phone service since she was 16. It had started as a practical safety measure when she began driving, but it had continued through college and into her adult years. The monthly payment was small enough that I'd never bothered to ask her to take over the account, and she'd never offered. But that cell phone represented something larger than just convenience. It was a constant reminder that she was still my dependent, still my responsibility, still someone I was taking care of even as she treated me like an inconvenience in her life. I transferred the number to her name and set up the account to automatically terminate 7 days after the wedding. She would have exactly 1 week of honeymoon bliss before discovering that her phone service had been disconnected for non-payment. By the time all these changes were in motion, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't anxiously trying to anticipate Rebecca's needs or manage her reactions or prevent her from being upset with me. I was simply dealing with the practical realities of a relationship that had become entirely one-sided. The wedding day itself was absolutely beautiful. Everything Rebecca had demanded, everything she'd envisioned, everything I'd paid for came together exactly as planned. The venue was elegant, the flowers were stunning, the food was delicious, and she looked like a fairy tale princess in her perfect dress. I played my role flawlessly. I smiled for photos, I mingled with guests, I gave a touching speech about how proud I was of my daughter and how happy I was to welcome Marcus into our family. I danced with Paul during the father-daughter dance, maintaining the fiction that we were a united family celebrating a joyous occasion. But I also watched. I watched Rebecca dismiss the vendors I'd spent months coordinating with, treating them like servants rather than professionals. I watched her snap at her bridesmaids when they weren't moving fast enough or standing in the right positions for photos. I watched her ignore the guests who had traveled long distances to celebrate with her, focusing instead on making sure every moment was being properly documented for social media. Most importantly, I watched how she treated me throughout the day. During the photo session, she repeatedly corrected my posture, my expression, and my positioning. "Mom, stand up straighter. Mom, smile like you mean it. Mom, move to the left so you're not blocking Marcus." During the ceremony, when I walked her down the aisle in Paul's absence, she barely looked at me. Her eyes were fixed on Marcus, on the photographer, on the guests who were watching and recording the moment. When I kissed her cheek and placed her hand in Marcus's, she turned away from me immediately, as if I'd already served my purpose and could be dismissed. During the reception, she introduced me to her new in-laws with a tone that suggested I was a slightly embarrassing obligation rather than someone they should be excited to know. "This is my mother, Alina. She's been so helpful with the wedding planning." Helpful, as if I'd been a hired coordinator rather than the person who had funded and organized every aspect of the celebration they were all enjoying. But it was during the speeches that everything finally came into focus. Rebecca had insisted on giving her own speech, something she'd been working on for weeks. She thanked Marcus for choosing her, she thanked the bridal party for their support, she thanked the guests for celebrating with them. She mentioned several people by name, acknowledging their specific contributions to the wedding or their importance in her life. She never mentioned me, not once. In a 10-minute speech at a wedding I had paid for entirely, in a celebration I had organized completely, surrounded by flowers I had chosen and food I had selected and music I had arranged, my own daughter did not find 30 seconds to acknowledge my existence. I sat at the head table, listening to her thank everyone except me, and felt the last piece of my heart that had been hoping for reconciliation finally break apart. But it was what happened after the speeches that would become the defining moment of our relationship. As Rebecca stepped down from the small stage where she'd given her speech, an elderly guest approached her with a compliment about how lovely the wedding was. Mrs. Patterson was a family friend I'd known for years, someone who had watched Rebecca grow up and who had always been kind to both of us. Rebecca, dear, Mrs. Patterson said warmly, everything is absolutely beautiful. You and your mother did such a wonderful job putting this together. Rebecca's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, she said sweetly. I'm so glad you're enjoying the celebration. Mrs. Patterson turned to include me in the conversation. Eleanor, you must be so proud, and so relieved to have all the planning finally come together so perfectly. That's when Rebecca said it. Actually, Mrs. Patterson, my mother didn't really do much of the planning. I handled most of the details myself. Mom just wrote some checks. Just wrote some checks. 10 months of vendor meetings, contract negotiations, timeline coordination, problem solving. And stress management reduced to just wrote some checks. As if funding a $75,000 wedding was as simple as dropping coins in a parking meter. And as if my financial contribution was somehow less valuable than the creative decisions she'd made from the comfort of my house, while I handled all the logistical work. Mrs. Patterson looked confused and slightly uncomfortable. She knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't the kind of person who would write checks for a wedding without being deeply involved in making sure everything went well. Oh, she said uncertainly, well, it's a beautiful celebration regardless of who handled what. She moved away quickly, clearly sensing tension she didn't want to be caught in the middle of. I should have let it go. I should have recognized that Rebecca was trying to assert her independence and take credit for the day she saw as entirely hers. I should have understood that she needed to minimize my role in order to feel like the wedding was her own achievement. But I couldn't, Rebecca, I said quietly, stepping closer to her. I think Mrs. Patterson was just trying to be nice. There's no need to. To what? Rebecca interrupted, her voice still honey-sweet but her eyes turning sharp. To tell the truth, to clarify what actually happened. Sweetheart, we both worked hard to make this day special. There's no reason to make it sound like. Like what, Mom? Her voice was getting louder now, and a few nearby guests were starting to notice. Like you paid for everything? Because that's exactly what happened. You opened your checkbook and bought me a wedding. That doesn't make you the wedding planner. The guests who had been drifting closer were now openly staring. Marcus appeared at Rebecca's side, clearly trying to diffuse whatever was building between us. Babe, he said softly, putting his hand on her arm, maybe we should. No, Rebecca said, shaking him off without taking her eyes off me. I'm tired of pretending that writing checks is the same thing as actual work. I'm tired of letting Mom take credit for decisions she didn't make and problems she didn't solve. I felt something break open in my chest, a combination of hurt and rage and disappointment that I'd been holding back for months. Rebecca, I said, my voice shaking slightly, I spent 10 months of my life making sure this day would be exactly what you wanted. I negotiated with vendors, I coordinated schedules, I solved problems, I managed timelines. Yes, I paid for everything, but I also did everything. You did what I told you to do, she shot back. Following instructions isn't the same thing as being creative or making decisions. You were basically an expensive assistant. An expensive assistant. 200 guests, 10 months of planning, $75,000, and I was an expensive assistant. That's when I felt the last piece of my patience snap. You're right, I said, loud enough that the conversation around us stopped entirely. I was an expensive assistant. I was also the bank, the logistics coordinator, the problem solver, and the person who made sure that every single thing you demanded was delivered exactly as you specified. Rebecca's face flushed red, but not with embarrassment. With anger, don't you dare try to make this about you, she hissed. This is my wedding day, and I won't let you ruin it with some pathetic guilt trip about how much money you spent. I'm not trying to make this about me, I said. I'm simply asking for the basic courtesy of acknowledgement. Not praise, not credit, not applause. Just acknowledgement that I exist and that I've spent the last year trying to make you happy. Make me happy? Rebecca's voice reached a pitch that made several guests take steps backward. You think this is about making me happy? This is about you trying to buy forgiveness for being a terrible mother my entire life. The words hit me like a physical blow. I heard several people gasp, and I saw Marcus reach for Rebecca's arm again, but she was beyond restraint now. You think if you throw enough money at my wedding, I'll forget that you drove Dad away with your neediness and your constant complaining. You think if you pay for enough flowers and fancy food, I'll pretend you were actually there for me when I was growing up instead of being too wrapped up in your own problems to pay attention to what I needed. This was all wrong. Everything she was saying was a complete rewriting of our family history, a version of events that bore no resemblance to reality. I hadn't driven Paul away, we'd mutually agreed that our marriage had run its course. I hadn't been absent during her childhood. I'd attended every school event, every game, every performance, every milestone. But I could see in her eyes that she believed every word she was saying. Somehow in her mind, she had become the victim of my neglect rather than the beneficiary of my constant attention and support. Rebecca, I said quietly, that's not how things happened and you know it. Don't tell me what I know, she screamed. Don't stand there gaslighting me on my own wedding day. Gaslighting, the accusation was so far from reality that I actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that apparently infuriated her even more. You think this is funny? She demanded. You think destroying my wedding reception is amusing? I'm not destroying anything, I said, my voice getting stronger. I'm simply refusing to be erased from my own contribution to this day. That's when she slapped me. The sound echoed across the reception hall like a gunshot. 200 guests went completely silent. The band stopped playing mid-song. Even the waitstaff froze in place, unsure whether they should intervene or pretend they hadn't witnessed what had just happened. My cheek stung from the impact, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of realizing that my own daughter had just struck me in front of everyone we knew. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Rebecca looked as shocked as I felt, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd just done. Her hand was still raised slightly, trembling in the aftermath of the blow. The rational response would have been to leave immediately. The dignified response would have been to gather what was left of my composure and walk out with my head held high. The healthy response would have been to recognize that this relationship was beyond repair and remove myself from further abuse. Instead, I smiled, not a bitter smile or a sarcastic smile or a smile meant to hide my pain. A genuine, peaceful smile that started deep in my chest and spread across my face like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Because while Rebecca had been screaming at me about being an expensive assistant and a terrible mother, while she had been rewriting our family history and working herself up to the point of physical violence, I had been remembering something very important. She had no idea what I had already done. The papers were signed, the accounts were closed, the support systems were dismantled, the safety nets were removed. In exactly 7 days, when she returned from her honeymoon, Rebecca would begin discovering the real consequences of treating me like someone whose only value was financial. But right now, in this moment, she still believed she was in control. She still thought her cruelty had power over me. She still assumed that her inheritance was secure and that I would continue funding her lifestyle indefinitely. She was wrong about all of it. I'm sorry you feel that way, sweetheart, I said softly, my voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence of the reception hall. I hope someday you'll understand how much I love you. Then I turned and walked out. I didn't gather my purse or say goodbye to anyone or make a dramatic exit speech. I simply walked through the crowd of stunned guests, past the elegant decorations I had chosen, through the doors of the venue I had booked, and out into the parking lot where my car was waiting. As I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The constant weight of trying to earn Rebecca's love, trying to prove my worth, trying to justify my existence through my usefulness to her, all of it was gone. For the first time since her childhood, I was free to simply be myself without worrying about her reaction or her approval. The house felt different when I walked through the front door. Peaceful, quiet, mine. I poured myself a glass of wine, kicked off the expensive shoes I'd worn to match my mother-of-the-bride dress, and settled into Paul's old armchair with my phone. I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, most of them from wedding guests who had witnessed the slap and wanted to check on me or express their shock at Rebecca's behavior. But there was one message that made me smile again. It was from Mrs. Patterson. "Eleanor, I am appalled by what I witnessed tonight. That young woman has no idea how lucky she's been to have a mother who would sacrifice so much for her happiness. I hope you know that everyone in that room saw exactly who was behaving badly, and it wasn't you." Mrs. Patterson was right. Rebecca's public tantrum had revealed her true character to everyone who mattered. The guests who had watched her scream at me and strike me weren't going to remember her beautiful dress or her perfect flowers. They were going to remember the moment she showed them exactly who she really was. Over the next week, while Rebecca was on her honeymoon in Italy, another expense I had quietly covered, I received dozens of calls and visits from friends and family members who had witnessed the reception disaster. The universal sentiment was shock at Rebecca's behavior and admiration for how I had handled myself in the aftermath. But more importantly, I received a call from Marcus's mother. Linda had always been polite to me during the few interactions we'd had during wedding planning, but we'd never had an opportunity for a real conversation. She called me 3 days after the wedding, her voice careful but concerned. "Eleanor," she said, "I've been thinking about what happened at the reception and I wanted to reach out. Marcus told me some things about Rebecca's living situation and your financial support that I didn't know before, and I'm starting to understand that there might be more to the story than what we witnessed that night." I didn't say anything about the changes I'd made or the consequences that were already in motion. But I did answer Linda's questions honestly when she asked about Rebecca's financial independence and her plans for supporting herself as a married woman. "I think Marcus assumed that Rebecca had been contributing to household expenses while she was living with you," Linda said carefully. "But based on some things she said during the engagement period, I'm getting the impression that might not be accurate." "No," I said simply, Rebecca has never paid for housing or utilities or groceries. I've been supporting her completely for the past 2.5 years. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Eleanor, Linda said finally, I think my son may be in for some surprises about his new wife's financial situation. She was right, but she had no idea how significant those surprises were going to be. The first sign that the consequences were beginning appeared exactly 1 week after the wedding, when Rebecca called me from Italy at 3 in the morning my time, screaming about her phone being disconnected. Mom, what the hell did you do? She shouted into the phone, her voice distorted by what sounded like a terrible connection. My phone just stopped working completely. All my calls are dropping, my data isn't working, nothing. I was fully awake immediately, but I kept my voice calm and sleepy. What do you mean it stopped working, honey? I mean it's completely dead. Marcus and I were trying to call an Uber from the airport in Rome, and my phone just went to some recording saying the service had been terminated for non-payment. Non-payment. I've never missed a phone bill in my life. Because she'd never had a phone bill in her life, but I didn't say that. That's strange, I said. Have you tried restarting it? Of course I tried restarting it. Mom, this is serious. We're stuck at the airport with no way to contact our hotel or get transportation. Marcus's phone is working, but it's not set up for international service, and the charges are going to be astronomical. Well, I said gently, maybe you should contact the phone company when you get back from your honeymoon and see what happened. I need you to contact them now. You've been handling my phone account for years, you know all the details and the customer service information. Call them and fix this. The entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. Even after the way she'd treated me at her wedding, even after publicly humiliating me in front of 200 guests, she still expected me to drop everything and solve her problems for her. Rebecca, I said quietly, your phone account was transferred to your name last week. You're responsible for your own service now. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had actually dropped. What do you mean it was transferred to my name? She finally asked, her voice deadly quiet. I mean you're an adult and it's time for you to handle your own bills and responsibilities. The account information should have been mailed to you at Marcus's apartment. Marcus's apartment? Mom, you know all my mail still goes to your house. I never changed my address because you said I didn't need to worry about it. Another assumption that was about to cause her significant problems. Sweetheart, you'll need to contact the phone company directly and sort this out. I'm sure they can help you understand the new account structure. New account structure? What the hell are you talking about? Mom, you can't just abandon me while I'm in a foreign country. Abandon her? After 26 years of constant support, removing one convenience was abandonment. Rebecca, you're on your honeymoon with your husband. You're not alone and you're not abandoned. You're just going to have to figure out this one problem without my help. I heard her intake of breath and prepared myself for the explosion. I cannot believe you're doing this to me right now, she hissed. Do you have any idea what it's like to be stranded in a foreign airport with no working phone? Do you care at all that you're ruining my honeymoon? I was ruining her honeymoon by not immediately fixing a problem that existed because she had never bothered to take responsibility for her own basic expenses. I'm sure you and Marcus will figure it out, I said. You're both intelligent adults. Don't you dare patronize me, and don't act like this is about teaching me responsibility or some other bullshit excuse. This is about you punishing me for standing up to you at my wedding. Standing up to me? That's how she was remembering the moment when she screamed at me and slapped me in front of our entire community. Rebecca, I said, and now my voice was getting stronger, I am not punishing you for anything. I am simply no longer managing aspects of your adult life that you should have been handling yourself years ago. Aspects of my adult life? It's a phone bill, Mom. It's not some huge responsibility. Then it should be easy for you to manage going forward. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Rebecca alternating between fury and pleading, trying to convince me to call the phone company and restore her service immediately. When those tactics didn't work, she tried guilt, reminding me of how much stress she was under as a newlywed and how unreasonable it was for me to create additional problems during what should have been the happiest time of her life. I remained calm throughout all of it, simply repeating that she would need to handle the situation herself. The call finally ended when Marcus apparently convinced her to use his phone to contact their hotel, despite the international charges. But that was just the beginning. Over the next month, as Rebecca settled into married life and began trying to establish routines and systems with Marcus, she started discovering the full extent of the changes I had made. The first major revelation came when she tried to apply for a joint credit card with Marcus and discovered that several of her existing accounts were reporting late payments and delinquencies. The creditors I had been listed as a reference for had noted the change in her residential status and removed the positive references I had been providing. Without those references, her credit applications were being declined, and her existing credit limits were being reduced. She called me in a panic, convinced that there had been some kind of mistake or identity theft. "Mom, something is seriously wrong with my credit report," she said, her voice tight with stress. "There are all these negative marks that weren't there before, and my credit card company just cut my limit in half." "What kind of negative marks?" I asked. "Late payments, missed payments, stuff that doesn't make sense. I always pay my bills on time." This wasn't technically true. Rebecca paid the minimum amounts required to avoid default, but she was frequently late with those payments and had missed several altogether during periods when her income was particularly irregular. The difference was that when creditors had called me as her reference, I had vouched for her stability and reliability based on my own financial situation rather than her actual payment history. "Have you contacted the credit reporting agencies to dispute the errors?" I asked. "That's not the point," she snapped. "The point is that this stuff shouldn't be showing up in the first place." I've never had credit problems before, because she'd never been fully responsible for her own credit before, but I didn't explain that. "Maybe you should consider working with a financial advisor to understand what's happening and develop a plan to improve your credit score." "A financial advisor?" "Mom, I don't need a financial advisor. I need you to help me figure out why my credit report suddenly looks like a disaster." "Rebecca, I can't help you with your credit reports. That's something you'll need to handle yourself." The next major crisis came when she and Marcus started seriously house hunting and discovered that Rebecca's debt-to-income ratio made her a liability rather than an asset in the mortgage application process. Marcus called me directly, something he had never done before. "Eleanor," he said, his voice careful but strained, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but Rebecca and I are having some problems with getting pre-approved for a mortgage, and she thought you might have some insight." I liked Marcus. He was a good man who genuinely loved Rebecca, and I suspected he was beginning to understand that the woman he'd married came with financial complications he hadn't anticipated. "What kind of problems are you having?" I asked. "Well, the mortgage broker is saying that Rebecca's debt levels are too high relative to her income for her to be included as a co-borrower. But she's been telling me that her financial situation was stable because she'd been living with you without major expenses." "That's true," I said. "Rebecca hasn't had housing or utility costs for the past 2.5 years." "Right, but apparently she's been using that advantage to take on other debt instead of building savings. The broker says she has about $40,000 in credit card and loan balances that we didn't know about." $40,000, even I was surprised by that number. During the years Rebecca had been living with me rent-free, she had apparently been treating her zero housing costs as an opportunity to finance a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford. "I see," I said carefully. "Eleanor, I'm not trying to create problems or point fingers, but I'm wondering if you knew about these debt levels when Rebecca was living with you." This was a fair question, and Marcus deserved an honest answer. "Marcus, I knew Rebecca had some credit cards and loan payments, but I didn't know the total amounts. She never discussed her financial situation with me in detail, and I didn't think it was appropriate to pry into her private affairs." "Right, of course. It's just that she's been telling me that living with you was helping her get her finances in order, and apparently the opposite was happening." The opposite was exactly what had been happening. By eliminating Rebecca's largest expense category, I had inadvertently enabled her to dig herself into a much deeper financial hole than would have been possible if she'd been paying market rent. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this," I said sincerely. "I had no idea things had gotten so complicated." "It's not your fault," Marcus said quickly. "I just don't understand why she didn't mention any of this before we got married. I mean, 40,000 in debt is something couples should discuss before they're making joint financial decisions." He was right, and we both knew it. But Rebecca had spent years managing her financial life by avoiding conversations about money and relying on other people to bail her out when her poor decisions caught up with her. She had probably convinced herself that marriage to Marcus would somehow solve her problems without requiring her to actually address them honestly. "Have you talked to Rebecca about working with a credit counselor or financial planner?" I asked. "I suggested it, but she says she doesn't need professional help. She says the debt isn't as bad as it looks on paper and that she just needs some time to pay it down." Time to pay it down with what money, I wondered. Marcus had a decent job, but not the kind of income that could easily absorb $40,000 in debt that wasn't his responsibility, especially while they were trying to establish a household and save for a house. "Well," I said carefully, "maybe this is an opportunity for both of you to start fresh with complete honesty about your financial situations." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said finally, "can I ask you something? During the time Rebecca was living with you, were you providing financial support beyond just housing?" Another fair question that deserved an honest answer. "Yes," I said. "I covered all household expenses, groceries, utilities, internet, cable, and I occasionally helped with other costs when she had emergencies." "What kind of emergencies?" I thought about the past 2.5 years. Car repairs when Rebecca's vehicle broke down, medical bills when she didn't have insurance through her part-time jobs, credit card payments when she was facing late fees, emergency dental work, a laptop when hers died, clothes for job interviews, gas money when she was between paychecks, various things, I said, car repairs, medical expenses, that sort of thing. How often would you say these emergencies came up? Fairly regularly, I admitted. Marcus sighed heavily. Elena, I think Rebecca may have been more financially dependent on you than either of us realized, and now that she's married to me, she might be expecting that level of support to continue. He was absolutely right, and I suspected he was already beginning to see signs of that expectation in his new wife's spending patterns and financial assumptions. Marcus, I said gently, Rebecca is a good person, but she's never learned to live within her means because she's never had to face the real consequences of her financial decisions. Marriage might be an opportunity for her to develop those skills. Or it might be an opportunity for her to transfer her financial dependency from you to me, he said quietly. I didn't respond to that because we both knew it was probably true. The conversation with Marcus helped me understand that the consequences of my changes were rippling outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. Rebecca wasn't just losing the financial support I had been providing, she was also losing the ability to hide her financial irresponsibility from the people who needed to understand it. But the biggest revelation was still to come. 6 weeks after the wedding, Rebecca showed up at my house unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the garden, enjoying the late summer weather and the quiet satisfaction of maintaining my own space according to my own preferences for the first time in years. When I heard the car door slam in my driveway, I looked up to see Rebecca storming toward my front door. Even from a distance, I could see that she was furious. I took my time finishing the section of weeding I'd been working on, washed my hands with the garden hose, and walked slowly toward the house. Rebecca was waiting for me on the front porch, her face flushed with anger and her hands clenched into fists. We need to talk, she said without preamble. Hello, Rebecca, I said calmly. How are you settling into married life? Don't pretend you don't know why I'm here, she snapped. Don't act innocent when you know exactly what you've done. I unlocked the front door and gestured for her to come inside. She pushed past me and went directly to the living room, where she turned to face me with her arms crossed. I've been having a very interesting conversation with my credit card companies, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Apparently, you called them and told them I was no longer living here and that you wouldn't be providing housing or financial support anymore. That's correct, I said. What gives you the right to interfere with my credit accounts? I didn't interfere with anything, Rebecca. I simply provided accurate information when the companies called to verify your housing situation for their periodic reviews. Periodic reviews? That's bullshit, Mom. You called them specifically to sabotage my credit. This wasn't true, but I could understand why she might see it that way. When creditors had contacted me for reference updates, I had been completely honest about the changes in our living arrangement and my financial support. I hadn't volunteered negative information about Rebecca, but I also hadn't continued to provide the positive references that had been propping up her credit worthiness. Rebecca, I told them the truth when they asked. Nothing more, nothing less. The truth according to you, she shot back, your version of events. My version of events is that you're a married adult who no longer lives with me and who is responsible for your own financial obligations. Is that inaccurate? She stared at me with something approaching hatred. You know what this has done to me, don't you? She said. You know that Marcus and I can't get approved for a mortgage because of the credit problems you created. You know that we're stuck in his tiny apartment instead of being able to buy a house like normal newlyweds. Normal newlyweds, I thought, generally discuss their financial situations honestly before getting married and make realistic plans based on their actual income and debt levels. Rebecca, your credit problems weren't created by me. They existed already, they were just being hidden by the financial support I was providing. Financial support that you withdrew without warning. Financial support that you promised would always be there. When did I promise that my support would always be there? I asked quietly. She faltered for a moment, clearly trying to remember a specific conversation or commitment that had never actually happened. You didn't have to say it explicitly, she said finally. It was implied, it was understood. You're my mother, supporting me is what you're supposed to do. Supporting me is what you're supposed to do. Even now, even after everything that had happened, she still saw me as existing primarily to serve her needs and solve her problems. Rebecca, I said, I supported you for 26 years. I fed you, clothed you, housed you, educated you, and helped you through every crisis and transition of your adult life. But at some point, that support has to transition into independence. Independence, she laughed bitterly. Is that what you call abandoning your daughter right after her wedding? Is that what you call sabotaging my marriage before it even gets started? I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm simply no longer enabling poor financial decisions that you should have learned to avoid years ago. Enabling, Rebecca's voice rose to a shout, is that what you call being a loving mother? Is that how you justify years of so-called generosity? Rebecca, I was a loving mother. I gave you everything I had to give, and I continued giving long after you stopped appreciating or even acknowledging what you were receiving. Oh, here we go, she said, rolling her eyes dramatically. The martyr act, poor mom, sacrificing so much for her ungrateful daughter. I'm not playing a martyr, sweetheart, I'm simply stating facts. Facts according to your twisted version of reality. The fact is that you're a bitter, lonely woman who can't stand to see other people happy. The fact is that you're punishing me for getting married and having a life that doesn't revolve around managing your feelings. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that I'd learned to associate with Rebecca's more vicious attacks, but this time it was accompanied by something else. A kind of detached curiosity about how far she was willing to go, how deep her cruelty could reach when she felt cornered. The fact is, she continued, that you've spent years using money to control me, and now that I'm married and don't need your approval anymore, you're trying to destroy my life out of spite. Using money to control her. This was perhaps the most stunning rewriting of our relationship yet. In Rebecca's mind, my financial support had been a manipulation tactic rather than genuine care, and my withdrawal of that support was vindictive rather than necessary. Rebecca, I said quietly, if I had been using money to control you, wouldn't I have threatened to withdraw support when you treated me badly? Wouldn't I have set conditions or requirements in exchange for my help? She paused, clearly not having considered this obvious flaw in her logic. That's different, she said finally. That would have been honest manipulation. What you did was worse. You pretended to be generous while secretly keeping track of everything so you could use it against me later. Keeping track of what? All of it, she exploded. Every dollar you spent, every favor you did, every sacrifice you made. You kept a mental scoreboard so that when you decided you were tired of being my mother, you could throw it all back in my face. This was projection of the most obvious sort. Rebecca was describing her own approach to relationships, the careful calculation of what she owed and what she was owed, the constant negotiation of obligations and benefits. She couldn't imagine that someone might give freely without expecting specific returns because that's not how her mind worked. Sweetheart, I said, I never kept a scoreboard. I gave you what I gave you because I love you and because I wanted you to be happy and secure. Bullshit, she spat. If that were true, you wouldn't have cut me off the minute I didn't perform gratitude to your satisfaction. I didn't cut you off because of gratitude, Rebecca. I made changes because I realized that my support was preventing you from learning to take care of yourself. Take care of myself? Mom, I've been taking care of myself for years. Just because I lived with you doesn't mean I was dependent on you. The delusion was breathtaking. She had been living rent-free in my house, eating food I bought, using utilities I paid for, benefiting from my financial references and emergency bailouts, and somehow she had convinced herself that this was independence. You're right, I said calmly. You have been taking care of yourself, which is why the changes I made shouldn't affect you so significantly. The trap in my logic was so obvious that even Rebecca could see it. If she truly had been independent and self-sufficient, then losing my support wouldn't have created credit problems or mortgage application issues or phone service disconnections. Her face went through several different expressions as she processed this, finally settling on a kind of cold fury that made her look older and harder than I'd ever seen her. You think you're so clever, don't you? She said quietly. You think you've taught me some valuable lesson about responsibility and gratitude. I think I've removed obstacles that were preventing you from becoming the capable adult I know you can be. What you've done, she said, taking a step closer to me, is declare war on your own daughter. And if that's how you want to play this, then that's exactly what you'll get. I looked at this young woman I had raised and loved and supported for 26 years, and I realized that she was absolutely right. In her mind, this had become a war. Not a natural transition from dependence to independence, not a necessary boundary-setting exercise, not even a consequence of her own poor choices. A war that I had started by refusing to continue enabling her. I don't want a war with you, Rebecca, I said sadly. I want you to have a happy, successful, independent life. Too late for that, she replied. You made your choice when you decided to sabotage my marriage and destroy my financial stability. Now you get to live with the consequences. She turned and walked toward the front door, then paused and looked back at me. You know what the really pathetic thing is, Mom? You could have had a relationship with me and my children and my husband. You could have been part of a real family, but you chose your petty revenge over having people who loved you. Then she left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood in my quiet living room for a long time afterward, thinking about what she'd said. The threat about consequences, the accusation of petty revenge, but most of all, the claim about choosing revenge over love. Because that's what she genuinely believed had happened. In Rebecca's version of events, I was a bitter, vindictive woman who had chosen to destroy her happiness rather than accept a subordinate role in her adult life. She couldn't see that her love had been entirely conditional on my continued financial support, or that her vision of family required me to enable her irresponsibility indefinitely. She couldn't understand that real love sometimes means allowing people to face the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are painful. But she was right about one thing: there would be consequences for me too. Over the next several months, Rebecca made good on her threat. She systematically removed me from every aspect of her life that she could control. She blocked my phone number and email address. She removed me from her social media accounts. She told Marcus's family that I was mentally unstable and financially abusive, effectively poisoning any possibility of a relationship with my son-in-law's relatives. Most painfully, she made it clear that any children she and Marcus might have would never know me. I would not be informed of pregnancies, invited to births, included in celebrations, or acknowledged as a grandmother. The isolation was profound and heartbreaking. For the first few months, I found myself reaching for the phone to call her dozens of times a day, forgetting that the relationship was over. I would see something funny or interesting and think about sharing it with her, only to remember that she no longer wanted to hear from me. But slowly, something unexpected happened. I began to rediscover who I was when I wasn't constantly managing Rebecca's crises and reactions and demands. I started traveling again, something I hadn't done since before her father and I divorced. I rekindled friendships that had been neglected during the years of Rebecca's high-maintenance presence in my life. I took up painting, joined a book club, volunteered at the animal shelter. For the first time in decades, my time and energy and financial resources were my own to direct according to my own values and interests. The house felt peaceful instead of tense. I could make plans without wondering whether Rebecca would need something from me that would require changing them. I could make decisions based on my own preferences rather than trying to anticipate and prevent her disapproval. Most importantly, I began to understand the difference between being loved and being needed. Rebecca had needed me desperately, but that need had never translated into respect, appreciation, or genuine affection. She had seen me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. 6 months after our final confrontation, I received a call from Linda, Marcus's mother. "Eleanor," she said, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I've been thinking about you and wondering how you're doing." I was surprised to hear from her, especially since Rebecca had presumably shared her version of events with Marcus's family. "I'm doing well, Linda," I said. "How are you?" "I'm fine, but I'm concerned about Marcus and Rebecca. They're having some serious financial problems, and I'm starting to understand that the situation is more complicated than Rebecca initially led us to believe." I didn't say anything, waiting to see what Linda had learned. "Eleanor, did Rebecca really live with you for 2.5 years without paying rent or contributing to household expenses?" "Yes," I said simply. "And during that time, were you helping her with other financial obligations as well?" "Yes." Linda sighed heavily. "I think Marcus is beginning to understand that he married someone who has never learned to manage money responsibly. And I think Rebecca is expecting him to take over the role you used to play in keeping her financially stable." This was exactly what I had predicted, but I took no satisfaction in being right. "How is Marcus handling it?" I asked. "Not well. They've had some serious arguments about money, and Rebecca keeps talking about how you abandoned her and sabotaged her credit deliberately. But Marcus has done his own research into their financial situation, and he's starting to realize that the problems existed long before you withdrew your support. That must be difficult for both of them." "Eleanor," Linda said carefully, "I don't think Rebecca has told Marcus the full truth about what happened between you two. She's painted a picture of a controlling, vindictive mother who couldn't stand to see her daughter happy. But based on what I witnessed at the wedding and what I'm learning about the financial situation, I suspect there's more to the story." I appreciated Linda's diplomatic approach, but I wasn't going to badmouth Rebecca to her mother-in-law, no matter how accurate such criticism might be. Linda, Rebecca, and I had different perspectives on what our relationship should look like as she transitioned into adulthood. Sometimes those kinds of disagreements can't be resolved. "Different perspectives," Linda repeated thoughtfully. "Eleanor, can I ask you something? Do you miss her?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt tears spring to my eyes unexpectedly. "Every day," I said honestly, "but I don't miss the person she became toward me. I miss the daughter I thought I had, the relationship I thought we could have." "I understand," Linda said softly, "and I want you to know that not everyone believes Rebecca's version of events. Marcus is starting to ask questions about what really happened, and I think he's beginning to understand that there were probably mistakes made on both sides." Mistakes made on both sides. It was a generous interpretation, and I appreciated Linda's attempt to find middle ground. But I knew that from Rebecca's perspective, I had committed the unforgivable sin of refusing to continue enabling her, and there was no middle ground that could bridge that fundamental disagreement. A year later, Linda called me again with news that I had been expecting but still wasn't prepared for. Rebecca was pregnant. "I thought you should know," Linda said gently. "I know this must be difficult news, given the situation." It was difficult, but not in the way Linda probably imagined. I wasn't hurt by being excluded from this milestone. I had accepted that exclusion months earlier. What hurt was knowing that my grandchild would grow up hearing a distorted version of who I was, and that Rebecca would likely raise her children with the same sense of entitlement and disregard for others that had characterized her own upbringing. But there was nothing I could do about that. The choices Rebecca made as a mother would be her responsibility, just as the financial choices she made as an adult had become her responsibility when I stopped enabling them. The baby was born on a snowy February morning, a little girl they named Emma. Linda shared a few photos with me, and I spent hours looking at this beautiful child who would never know me. But I also felt a strange sense of peace. This little girl would grow up with parents who were learning to navigate financial responsibility together. She would not grow up in a household where one person was constantly bailing everyone else out of the consequences of poor decisions. Whatever mistakes Rebecca made as a mother, at least she would have to face them directly rather than relying on someone else to fix them. 3 years have passed since that terrible wedding day when my relationship with my daughter ended in a public slap and a private smile. Rebecca and Marcus are still married, though Linda occasionally shares concerns about the stress that financial problems have put on their relationship. They've learned to live within their means, mostly because they have no choice. Rebecca has developed budgeting skills and financial discipline that she never needed when I was subsidizing her lifestyle. She's also apparently developed a very different relationship with Linda than the one she had with me. According to Linda, Rebecca is respectful and appreciative of help when it's offered, but she doesn't demand or expect constant support. It seems that marriage taught her lessons about mutual respect that 26 years of my parenting somehow failed to convey. I've learned lessons too. I've learned that love without boundaries isn't really love, it's enabling. I've learned that protecting someone from the consequences of their choices prevents them from learning to make better choices. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop helping them in ways that keep them helpless. Would I do things differently if I had the chance? In some ways, yes. I would have set boundaries much earlier. I would have required Rebecca to contribute to household expenses when she moved back in with me after college. I would have insisted on financial transparency and responsibility as conditions of my support. But I wouldn't change the fundamental decision I made. Rebecca needed to learn that relationships are based on mutual respect and that financial support is a gift, not an entitlement. She needed to develop the skills and character that would allow her to be a good wife and mother. She needed to understand that actions have consequences and that other people's kindness should never be taken for granted. Those lessons came at a cost for both of us. I lost the relationship with my daughter that I had treasured for 26 years. She lost the financial safety net that had allowed her to avoid facing her own limitations and mistakes. But we both gained something too. I gained my independence and self-respect. I learned to value relationships based on genuine affection rather than need or obligation. I discovered interests and friendships and pursuits that had nothing to do with managing Rebecca's crisis-filled lifestyle. And Rebecca, despite her anger and resentment, gained the skills she needed to build a stable adult life. She learned to budget, to prioritize, to communicate honestly with her spouse about money, and to solve problems without expecting someone else to rescue her. The little girl they named Emma is now 3 years old, and according to Linda, she's bright and curious and loved. Rebecca has apparently become a devoted mother who works hard to provide for her daughter's needs. She and Marcus have bought a small house and are talking about having another child. In other words, Rebecca has become the responsible adult I always hoped she could be. The irony is that she had to hate me to get there. Sometimes I wonder if she'll ever understand what really happened during those difficult months when our relationship fell apart. I wonder if she'll ever realize that my withdrawal of support wasn't vindictive but necessary, not punitive but educational. But mostly, I've learned to be at peace with not knowing. The relationship I have with my daughter now is the relationship her choices created. The grandmother I'll never get to be is the consequence of her decision to prioritize resentment over reconciliation. And the smile I gave her after she slapped me at her wedding, that wasn't cruelty or satisfaction or revenge. That was the smile of someone who had finally learned to love wisely instead of just completely. Because sometimes, the greatest act of love is teaching someone that their actions have consequences, even when those consequences break your heart. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to prove they're stronger than their worst impulses. And sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do as a parent is step back and let your child discover who they really are when no one is rescuing them from themselves. My name is Elena, and I smiled when my daughter slapped me because I knew something she didn't know. I knew that the papers I had signed, the accounts I had closed, the support I had withdrawn would eventually teach her lessons that 26 years of unconditional enabling had failed to provide. I knew that someday, when she was older and perhaps facing her own challenges with her children, she might understand that love isn't always soft and kind and accommodating. Sometimes love is firm and clear and uncompromising. Sometimes love looks like saying no when someone expects you to say yes. Sometimes love looks like walking away when someone expects you to stay and fight. And sometimes, love looks like smiling through heartbreak because you know that your pain today might prevent someone else's pain tomorrow. 3 years later, I can honestly say that losing my relationship with Rebecca was the most difficult and the most necessary thing I've ever done. It taught me that I am more than just someone's mother, someone's financial support system, someone's problem solver. It taught me that I deserve to be treated with respect and kindness, not just because of what I can provide, but because of who I am. It taught me that enabling someone's worst behavior isn't love, it's fear disguised as generosity. Most importantly, it taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction, even when that someone is your own child. I still hope that someday Rebecca and I might find a way to rebuild some kind of relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. I still dream about meeting my granddaughter and maybe helping to teach her the lessons her mother had to learn the hard way. But I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my own well-being and self-respect to make that reconciliation happen on Rebecca's terms. If she ever decides she wants a relationship with me based on genuine love rather than financial convenience, I'll be here. Until then, I'm living a life that's entirely my own for the first time in decades. I'm making choices based on my own values and interests. I'm building relationships with people who appreciate me for who I am rather than what I can do for them. I'm learning that it's never too late to teach someone you love that actions have consequences, that respect is not negotiable, and that true independence is worth more than any financial support. And when I remember that moment at the wedding, when my daughter's hand struck my face and I smiled in return, I still feel that same sense of peaceful certainty. Not because I enjoyed her pain or took satisfaction in her struggles, but because I knew that for the first time in her adult life, she was going to have the opportunity to discover who she really was when no one was rescuing her from the consequences of her choices. That opportunity was the last gift I could give her, even though she experienced it as abandonment, and my smile was the last act of faith I could offer, even though she interpreted it as cruelty. Sometimes love looks like letting go. Sometimes wisdom looks like walking away. And sometimes the greatest victory is choosing your own peace over someone else's chaos, even when that someone is the person you love most in the world. My name is Elena, and I smiled because I had already won the only battle that really mattered, the battle to reclaim my own life and dignity. Everything else was just consequences playing out exactly as they needed to. If Elena's story resonated with you, you're in the right place. Here at Wisdom Strikes Back, we share stories of seniors who refuse to be underestimated and prove that experience is power. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you believe that wisdom and dignity deserve respect. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their own strength. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age? How did you handle it? Your stories inspire our community. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are never too old to stand up for yourself. Until next time, keep proving that wisdom strikes back.